For most of the 20th century, one idea sat at the center of how scientists understood human evolution, that our lineage was defined by a straight march toward bigger and bigger brains. Every step forward, from ancient ape to modern human, was assumed to come with more brain volume, more cognitive capacity, more complexity. Then, in 2003, researchers digging in a cave on the remote Indonesian island of Flores found something that broke that story completely. An adult skeleton, remarkably complete, belonging to an individual who stood barely over 1 meter tall, roughly 3.5 feet, with a brain not much larger than a chimpanzee's. She lived somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, meaning she wasn't some ancient, primitive ancestor from deep in our evolutionary past. She was recent. Startlingly recent. Scientists gave her species a formal name, Homo floresiensis, and the world gave her an unofficial one almost immediately, the Hobbit. And she didn't come alone. Researchers eventually recovered evidence of at least a dozen individuals from the same small cave, along with stone tools and the bones of a pygmy elephant species that shared her island. This was not a fluke, a birth defect, or an isolated oddity. This was an entire population of small-statured humans, thriving on one island, for hundreds of thousands of years. And more than 20 years later, new research is still uncovering exactly how, and why, they got so small. The discovery site itself is called Liang Bua, a limestone cave in the highlands of Flores. The most complete skeleton recovered there is known by its catalog number, LB1, an adult female whose skull immediately stood out to researchers. Her brain case was small enough that some early observers assumed a mistake had been made in dating or identification. But everything about her skeleton told a consistent story. Her shoulders sat in a forward, shrugged position unlike a modern human's. She had no chin, a receding forehead, and unusually large teeth crowded into a small jaw. Her feet were notably large relative to her short legs, a genuinely unusual proportion among hominins. And crucially, this wasn't just one strange individual. Stone tools recovered from the same cave layers date back as far as 190,000 years, meaning this population, or its ancestors, had been living on Flores and making tools for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. The evidence pointed to a small, capable population who used fire, crafted stone implements, and successfully hunted large prey on their island home, despite standing barely taller than a modern 7-year-old child. This was, by any reasonable measure, a fully functioning human society, just one built at a dramatically different scale than any other member of our genus. Naturally, a discovery this strange invited fierce scientific debate almost immediately. If an adult human could have such a small brain and such an unusual body, some researchers wondered whether LB1 wasn't a new species at all, but simply a modern human suffering from a developmental condition, perhaps a form of microcephaly, or a growth disorder similar to Down syndrome. It's a reasonable scientific instinct. Extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary scrutiny, and a single skeleton with unusual proportions could, in principle, represent individual pathology rather than an entire distinct species. But the evidence continued to push back against that explanation. This wasn't just one unusual skeleton. Multiple individuals from the same cave, spanning different points in time, showed consistent small stature and matching skeletal features. A genuine developmental disorder affecting one person doesn't typically produce an entire, consistent population showing the same distinct anatomy generation after generation. The pathology theories, while worth taking seriously, were up against a mounting body of evidence suggesting something more fundamental, an entire lineage that had evolved, deliberately and consistently, toward small body size, likely in response to the unique pressures of life on an isolated island. In 2017, a research team led by Debbie Argue at the Australian National University put the pathology debate to a much more rigorous test. The team analyzed 133 distinct anatomical characteristics across the Homo floresiensis skeleton, comparing them systematically against every other known hominin species, looking specifically for any pattern that matched known developmental disorders. None of their tests supported the idea that Homo floresiensis was simply a diseased or malformed modern human. Instead, the analysis pointed towards something genuinely different, a long-surviving, distinct lineage, with roots that traced back to some of the earliest members of our genus, potentially connected to species like Homo habilis, rather than descending directly from more recent, larger-bodied Homo erectus populations. This was a serious, credible theory, and for years it left the Hobbits' precise ancestry as one of the most contested open questions in all of human evolution. Had they arrived on Flores as an already ancient, already small lineage from deep in Homo's history? Or did they descend from a taller, more familiar ancestor, and shrink dramatically once isolated on the island? Settling that question required finding fossils far older than anything recovered at Liang Bua itself. That evidence eventually came from a different site entirely, Mata Menge, a fossil-rich river plain location elsewhere on Flores. There, researchers recovered a small fragment of an arm bone, along with teeth, dated to approximately 700,000 years old, hundreds of thousands of years older than anything found at Liang Bua. And the fossils were, if anything, even smaller than their much later Liang Bua counterparts. The anatomical similarities between these older Flores fossils and Homo erectus specimens from the neighboring island of Java were strong enough that researchers concluded this earlier population almost certainly descended from Homo erectus, a taller-bodied species with proportions much closer to modern humans. The implication was striking. At some point roughly 1 million years ago, a population of Homo erectus reached Flores, likely by accident, crossing a genuinely treacherous stretch of open water to a neighboring island. Once stranded there, cut off from any further genetic exchange with mainland populations, that group began shrinking. And based on how small the 700,000-year-old fossils already were, that shrinking happened remarkably fast. Within roughly 300,000 years, a large-bodied human ancestor had become the diminutive Hobbit. With the question of ancestry largely settled, a new mystery took center stage. Exactly how does a body shrink this dramatically? And what does that process do to the brain along the way? In 2025, researchers at Western Washington University approached this question from an unexpected angle: teeth. Specifically, third molars, wisdom teeth. Across the wider hominin fossil record, spanning roughly 5 million years and 15 different species, there's a consistent pattern. As brain size increases across species over evolutionary time, wisdom teeth tend to get proportionally smaller. Species with larger, more ancient jaws and bigger wisdom teeth generally had smaller brains. Later species, like Neanderthals, with much larger brains, tended to have comparatively smaller wisdom teeth. This relationship exists because tooth formation and brain formation are closely linked processes that both begin very early in fetal development. That connection meant researchers could use tooth proportions as a kind of proxy, allowing them to estimate brain size trends even from fossil species known only from a handful of teeth, which describes an enormous portion of the entire human fossil record. And when the team applied this method to Homo floresiensis specifically, they found something that didn't fit the usual pattern at all. The Hobbit's wisdom teeth were small, proportionally in line with what you'd expect from a typical member of genus Homo, following the normal pattern of smaller wisdom teeth pairing with a larger brain. But their actual brain size was small too, dramatically so. That combination, small wisdom teeth alongside a small brain, is the unusual exception in this entire 5 million year dataset. And it matters, because there are two fundamentally different ways a brain can end up small. Growth can slow down before birth, during gestation, which tends to directly affect tooth size and formation, since teeth begin developing very early in fetal development. Or growth can slow down later, after birth, during childhood, which affects the rest of the skeleton without necessarily leaving the same signature on the teeth. Because the Hobbits' wisdom teeth looked entirely normal for their genus, the researchers concluded that whatever slowed their brain growth almost certainly happened after birth, not before it. In the womb, a developing Hobbit appears to have been on the same growth trajectory as any other member of Homo. Something afterward changed course. This finding connects directly to a broader evolutionary phenomenon called insular dwarfism, or insular nonnaism, the tendency for larger animals to evolve smaller body sizes after becoming isolated on islands, typically due to limited food availability and a lack of large predators. Flores itself provides one of the clearest supporting examples anywhere on Earth, in the form of the dwarf stegodon, a pygmy elephant species that shrank dramatically after becoming isolated on the same island, and which the hobbits themselves hunted for food. Homo floresiensis wasn't even the only human relative to follow this pattern. A separate, similarly small-statured species called Homo luzonensis has been identified on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, suggesting that whatever evolutionary pressures produced the hobbits on Flores weren't a one-off fluke, but a repeatable outcome whenever certain isolated island conditions were met. Limited food. Few large predators. A population cut off from the mainland for a long enough stretch of time. Under those specific conditions, it seems, dramatic size reduction is a genuinely available evolutionary pathway for large mammals, humans very much included. Perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this research has nothing to do with body size at all, and everything to do with what body size does, and doesn't, tell us. Brain size and body size are tightly linked across modern humans too. Taller people tend to have somewhat larger brains, on average, than shorter people. But that relationship says absolutely nothing about intelligence. A smaller body producing a proportionally smaller brain is simply a matter of scale, not capability. And the archaeological record backs this up unambiguously for the hobbits. Despite their small brains, Homo floresiensis crafted stone tools sophisticated enough to butcher large prey, successfully hunted animals many times their own body weight, and very likely controlled fire, all genuinely complex behaviors that earlier assumptions insisted required a large, modern-style brain to achieve. The hobbits quietly disproved that assumption just by surviving successfully on their island for hundreds of thousands of years. Small brain. Small body. Full capability. It's a combination the field simply hadn't seriously accounted for before Flores forced the issue. Picture LB1 standing beside you right now. She would come up to somewhere around your chest, small enough that you could rest a hand on the crown of her head. And yet this one population, barely a meter tall, extinct for tens of thousands of years, has forced an entire field to rewrite one of its most basic assumptions, not once, but twice. First, by proving that human evolution was never simply a straight march toward bigger brains. And more recently, by revealing that even the reason for their small brains wasn't a straightforward shrinking of the whole body evenly, it was a specific, targeted slowdown in growth that happened only after birth, leaving their prenatal development, and by extension their teeth, looking entirely ordinary. 2 decades of research, from a single small cave on a single remote island, and the story is still being rewritten as better methods arrive. Which detail changed how you think about this story the most? That their wisdom teeth looked completely normal while their brains stayed small, that an entire population shrank from a much larger ancestor in roughly 300,000 years, or that brain size, in the end, told us nothing about how capable they actually were? Drop your answer below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the human relatives who keep rewriting what we thought we knew.